From 12 News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White alongside 12 News politics editor Ted Nesi. Chaos in Afghanistan as U.S. troops withdraw from the region, and few lawmakers are being more closely watched in Washington than the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. That's Rhode Island U.S. Senator Jack Reed. Senator, thank you so much for joining us here at a very busy time for you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. You know, the first question is basic. What went wrong?
Well, I think very succinctly, the capacity of the Afghan government and military forces, and they're linked together, was overestimated, and the capacity of the Taliban was underestimated. And as a result, the speed of the progress of the Taliban was not anticipated. I think there was a general consensus that it would be very difficult for the Afghan government to, endure indefinitely, but I think there was general surprise that so quickly, within days, there was basically through not just military force, but surrendering of Afghan forces and other collapse.
The president, chose to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. What blame does he bear for what's going on right now?
Well, I think clearly, and as you said, the buck stopped there. In terms of the extraction of our military forces and of Afghans who helped us and American citizens who were there, that has been severely compromised by the rapid collapse of the Afghan forces, and that's something that, frankly, the president should, and has stood up and said, we have to fix this, we have to get this right. He inherited the situation starting, you could go back all the way to the Bush administration, where in November of 2001, we were still fighting in Tora Bora. Donald Rumsfeld called up the CENTCOM commander and said, stop planning for Iraq. You got a week. So we were taking our eye off the ball as far as back as the beginning of our efforts. But what was critically confining to the president was the agreement that President Trump signed in Doha, which essentially said to the Taliban, you don't attack us and we'll leave on a fixed date. It combined, first of all, official recognition of the Taliban, which we never have done. Second, it excluded the Afghan government. They weren't part of it. And then third, we were now tied to a date certain, and we had never done that before. It all had been conditionality. And the factor there was...
Couldn't Biden have torn up that agreement?
He could have done it, and I think he, I'm sure, contemplated it, but after that, I think what would have happened is that the Taliban would have started attacking our forces very vigorously. That was their only option remaining. Try to force us out by attacks upon our forces, by blue on green attacks, which take place where they infiltrate, or a sympathizer goes ahead and attacks a member of the Afghan army, attacks one of our personnel. That, I think, was the most likely outcome of saying we're staying indefinitely. And the other factor, too, I think, is that the situation was such that he felt, I think, I have not had a chance to chat personally and directly with him, that if we surged again, we'd have the same result as we had in the past. We could, in fact, tactically push back the Taliban, but once we started coming out again, they would renew their efforts. And the Afghan government itself had not been able to develop over 20 years an effective governance system, a real connection with their people, as well as a functional army, an army that could really function, except for a few units. Their special forces and their aviation were very credible.
Senator, Republicans are pushing back hard at, the pointing at the Doha agreement, the Trump administration's agreement with the Taliban, saying it's a dodge by the Biden administration for the, current failures to have a well-planned evacuation, to be ready for all alternatives, et cetera. I mean, how disappointed are you that it's not, you yourself, I've talked to you about it. You've been warning that pulling out was going to be difficult, and yet they the generals and the administration seem completely caught off guard by how quickly this happened.
I think you're absolutely right in terms of being caught off guard. I think they felt, just given the sheer size of the Afghan forces, 176,000 regular forces in their army, with desertions probably less than that, but about a 90,000 paramilitary auxiliary force together with police, that the Taliban would have just difficulties overcoming that. I think what was lost, and it goes back to the Doha Agreement, is once Doha was signed, the Taliban had a very powerful propaganda weapon to go to, and they did, into Afghan villages all over, not just in their homeland, but up in the north too, and say, listen, they're going, they signed this, they're leaving, we're going to stay. I think that, together with the lack of unity and coherence in the government in Afghanistan, was a significant factor. One of the other outcomes of Doha was the Doha Agreement forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 prisoners, many of whom just rejoined the Taliban as fighters, and that helped their military posture.
How concerned are you, and we should say we're taping this Thursday afternoon and events are moving very quickly, a lot of people are going to watch this Sunday morning. How concerned are you about the Taliban overrunning the airport or keeping Americans and Afghans who helped Americans from reaching the airport because they have a lot of control of the roads? How concerned are you about the situation further deteriorating in the coming days?
Well, there's two issues there. One is securing the airport. I don't think, given what's happened, that you assume anything. We have approximately 3,000 forces on the ground. We have the perimeter secured. General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, was on the scene just yesterday or the day before, directly speaking to the Taliban, saying, if you go after us, we're going after you, no holds barred. We have jet aircraft and the fighters just in the air as a demonstration that we can bring air power to bear instantaneously. So far, we've reestablished a schedule of flights coming in, both military flights and commercial charter flights coming in. The difficulty, as you point out, and it's a separate issue, is access to the airport, getting people there who are entitled to leave. That is still a continuing problem. That is something that both the State Department and the Department of Defense has to work on, and they have to do so in some rough collaboration, or at least parallel consciousness with the Taliban, saying, let these people through.
You have talked to Ted and I in the past on this program about how valuable it was for you to visit Afghanistan and talk personally with military leaders on the ground there and soldiers, and because of the pandemic, you have not been there in a long time. Do you feel that has affected your ability to understand the situation?
I think it's affected everyone's ability. I've been to Afghanistan 18 times, and when you get on the ground, you talk to the military leaders, and General Scotty Miller, our last four-star commander, was a very, very effective commander, very straightforward, and also getting out, particularly into the forward operating bases, talking to both U.S. forces, international forces, and Afghan forces. You get a sense, and you get a lot of feedback. And as you point out, because of COVID, we could not go into the country for a year, and not only could we not go in, General Miller could not easily come back and testify before the committee. The last commander there that testified, I think it was 2017, 2018, I will have to check my dates, but it was General Nicholson. So I think you're right, that has sort of prevented us from getting some insights we might have already gotten.
One of the arguments we're hearing this week, including from actually Congressman Langevin, who is not usually one to be outspoken, but he's been quite critical this week of the withdrawal and the decision to withdraw by the president. And he's among those suggesting that if Biden had just left the 2,500 or so American personnel there in perpetuity, that this could have been avoided. You could have kind of kept the government securing Kabul for the long term, I guess. But you, it sounds like, feel that it was only a stalemate because the Taliban thought Americans would leave, and if we said we weren't leaving, you think that would have changed?
I think so. I think the Taliban in the past have shown that they can and will attack American forces. They would have done that. They certainly, throughout the last year, have attacked and assassinated and attacked Afghan journalists, Afghan political leaders. I think, in fact, 2 weeks or so ago, I think they took out sort of the head of the Afghan information, their sort of PR person. So I think they would have, because they would have, committed to the struggle, saying we have no options left. To accept the American presence and stabilizing that government means, they win. And I think the Taliban would have. Now the question was, could we have, accepted those casualties over many years? And then the other question I think that we have to address is, and I don't think we would have been able to avoid putting more troops on the ground, because we're not going to leave 2,500 troops and start seeing them sort of picked off. We're going to increase our presence, we'll increase our air power, et cetera. And frankly, we'll get back into another surge, maybe not as quite as extensive as before, but another surge. But at the end of that surge, when we have to come pull down, will that government and that military, the Afghan military and government, be capable of taking, the role? And I think the events of the last few weeks suggested that no, for many reasons, cultural, historic, many factors.
All this money the U.S. military spent to train the Afghan military, it wasn't just training, it was also providing equipment. We're talking helicopters, missiles, guns. Is that all in the hands of the Taliban now?
It is. And it, well,
what does that mean?
Well, first of all of our equipment was completely evacuated.
I'm just talking about stuff provided to
But the dilemma we faced was, if you want the Afghan army to fight, they have to have the tools to do the job. So to collect up their weapons and helicopters before we left was it's absurd. But the consequences of their collapse was, yes, the Taliban has these weapons. I think the issue has to be is how can they use them? Again, I think there are very few trained helicopter pilots with the Taliban.
No, I get that.
There are no maintenance people there. Ammunition, of course they will. M16s, which we left, they will take in lieu of their AK-47s. And then, it'll get down within a few years of, I think the equipment will be just sitting there, frankly, most of the equipment.
We have to go
but it's a loss to us.
Indeed, and we have to go to a break in just a minute. So let me ask you this last question before we do. You reluctantly, I would say, went along with President Biden's call to withdraw from Afghanistan, knowing now what has happened. Was it a mistake?
I think at this juncture, we have to give it a bit more time in terms of whether, in terms of our overall security and safety as a nation, which is the primary responsibility of the president, we are in at least as good a position by withdrawal. That means we have to make sure we focus on continuing to be able to disrupt and destroy Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terrorist elements that are there. That, I think, is the long-run test. I think also, too, can we, through an international effort, somehow reach a better political outcome, which there is a government, which the Taliban was part of it, obviously, but it will not be a repeat of the Taliban of the 1990s.
When we come back, let's tackle that issue of U.S. safety and al-Qaeda. Our guest this week is Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, U.S. Senator Jack Reed. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White alongside 12 News Politics Editor Ted Nesi. Our guest this week is U.S. Senator Jack Reed. He is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Ted?
Well, as Tim just said, Senator, you've been the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, I think, for a bit more than half a decade now, since Senator Levin retired. You've been one of your party's leading military authorities, I'd say, for most of the time we've been in Afghanistan. Do you feel you share any responsibility as you reflect on this week's events? Were you tough enough on the generals who appeared before you? Did you question administration assumptions over the years when they were telling you the training is working and such?
Yeah, no, we tried. Coming back from every trip I took, and I took 18 trips there, we did a very detailed after-action report. Early on, we cited, for example, the roadblock mentality of the Afghan army. Instead of being tactically disposed, they just clomped on the roads. Much of that was a result of political and cultural, not tactical moves. We made criticisms throughout, but I think everyone has to start reflecting now what more we could have done. I think in particular, what we could have done with respect to how we evacuated, obviously, the situation. The scenes at the airport are horrific, particularly for veterans and for Gold Star families who've sacrificed so much. And those scenes will remain with us. I think there was the expectation, as we've said before, that there would be enough time. But in June, I went to the floor of the Senate and gave a speech and pointed out how we were losing to the Taliban influence in northern Iraq, which was the home of not their Pashtun cousins, but the Tajiks and others who fought violently against them. And that started sending signals. And I think, I would like to have been more vocal.
Another question on reflecting. You alluded to it earlier, and you've said this a lot, that you think the rapid pivot by the Bush administration to Iraq in the fall of 2001 and into 2002 was kind of the original sin of the Afghanistan conflict, because the military had to shift focus. There's a very sort of dispiriting way to look at that, which is that the war, the vast majority of these years then have been in vain because we'd kind of lost the plot so early. Do you see it that way, or do you think it was still salvageable in the years between then and now?
I think we lost the most critical time. In 2002 and 2003, when I was in country in 2003, we could actually get in vehicles, they weren't heavily armored, and drive out into the countryside 30, 40 minutes, sit down with the mayor, on the way back, divert and go and see, like every mayor, at the road he wanted to build, and we'd come back.
So the mayors in Afghanistan are like the ones when you come back here.
Exactly. So the situation, though, is within several years that you couldn't move any place unless you were in an aircraft or a helicopter. And then the situation got worse. We finally refocused after the Iraq situation became stabilized somewhat after the surge there. And then President Obama put in a significant surge of troops to try, to defeat that. We were successful tactically, but when we pulled those troops back, we saw the same political problems of corruption, of an Afghan military that was not well led, constant changes in leadership, politics that were fractured is a mild term. Power sharing between Ghani and Abdullah, conflicts there. And I think, again, at some point, and this goes back to, I think, the reasoning of the president, he'll have to explain himself, but my sense is that this was not going to be solved simply by the presence of the United States forces and more aid, et cetera. A lot of that aid, as you know, was pilfered. And the most outstanding thing at this point is that none of the Afghan leadership, neither Karzai nor Ghani, was able to connect with the people on a sense of we're in this together. We're Afghans. We have a mission together.
People always said they lacked a George Washington.
Indeed they did. And then the Taliban had a very simple message: get rid of the infidel, the American. That's it. They weren't trying to or responsible for building clinics and building education and building everything else. And at some point, I think, ironically, you saw that message, particularly after we signaled we're getting out regardless at some fixed date. The interesting factor, too, now is Afghanistan is such a turbulent country. We're already seeing counter-protests to the Taliban. We will probably see military militias start standing themselves up, particularly in northern Afghanistan. And so the ability...
So back to the situation we found in September 2001.
Right, the ability of the Taliban to govern will be, I think, challenged. And so that adds to the point that we should make, is that this is a transition. We're taking our forces out. We are, and with better and more effective action, we're going to get out our civilians, our SIVs, and our people who helped us get those folks out. But we still have to stay focused on the terrorism threat in Afghanistan from now over the horizon. And we have to be interested in the stability of that region. You have two nuclear powers, Pakistan and India. You have this, place now in which there will be lack of control and order. So we have to still stay focused, but not with conventional military forces.
You just brought up SIVs, which are special immigrant visas.
Yes.
Okay, and that brings up the topic of all the hundreds of interpreters that work with the U.S. military and are stuck there. And if the Taliban gets to them, they are likely going to lose their lives. They were denied for years these SIVs. Did the United States break a promise with them?
Well, this is one of those things where this is a factor too of we had to increase legislatively the SIV authorization.
But why not just wipe out this bureaucracy, Senator, in this moment?
No, that at this moment,
who cares about
effectively,
SIVs?
that's what's being done. But a year ago, and in fact during both the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration, we were trying to get these SIV limits increased. We finally got an increase just a few weeks ago on a supplemental bill to pay for the damage of the January 6th destruction. But for months it was being held up by our Republican colleagues, not because of SIVs, but because
Wait, the SIV increase was in the bill to...
We put it in the supplemental. Okay. We put it in the first thing we could get through. But I think at this point, to your point, is that we are being sort of very loose in terms of, okay, if you have a credible argument, we're trying to take people out who were students at schools affiliated with the United States because they might be blamed, if you will. And we're trying to do that. The other factor too, and this goes to, again, another, I think, criticism is that of the State Department, is that we're trying for months to establish third nations that would take these people so we could put them there, and that didn't materialize. And we're now, frankly, playing catch up, and it's very difficult because human lives are at stake.
Well, speaking of human lives, you mentioned it earlier, how dispiriting these pictures are. Nearly 2,400 American families lost a loved one fighting in Afghanistan, including certainly some Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts families. This has been clearly a hard week for many of them, as well as veterans who lived through, and you see their picture
Sergeant
of
Andrew
McKenna of Bristol, whose parents have spoken out. What is your message to those families, the Gold Star families, in light of what they've seen in recent days?
Well, what they've seen in recent days is not comparable to the sacrifice and service. We should have been able to plan a better, more humane evacuation, no doubt about that. But we have to continue to thank and salute the service of these men and their families. No one serves alone in the military. I had the privilege of meeting Andy McKenna, both in Bristol at the parade and also on the ground in Afghanistan when I was in one of my trips.
And you know his parents, Carol and Peter?
I do. They're wonderful people. And
she's very upset. I mean,
well, she has every right to be upset because of her decency and humanity was passed on to her son, and her decency and humanity is crying out now as she sees other mothers trying to get out. And I would think, and we're going to try to do the analysis by hearings, that we could have avoided this. Frankly, we should have avoided this, but I think it was possible to do that. And I think what you have to always remember, though, that because of their sacrifice, for 20 years we've not seen a repetition of 9/11 in the United States. We got bin Laden, who was the perpetrator. We have degraded terrorism attacks to a significant degree worldwide. And that was done because brave young men and women like Andy McKenna and others were willing to fight.
So when we have 1 minute left, when people ask, what was all this for? That's the answer.
I think that is the reason we went in. We accomplished that mission to date, but the mission goes on. We can't sort of turn our back and say it's all over. But that was it. And I think we tried for 20 years to build a country that would reflect our values, and I think we discovered that both historical, cultural, economic issues were very difficult to overcome.
U.S. Senator Jack Reed, Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, thank you very much for joining us. Real quick, have you scheduled a hearing for this yet? Has that been?
We haven't scheduled it, but we'll do it very promptly when we return to Washington. We're going back on the 13th of September.
Senator Jack Reed, thanks so much for joining us. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.